Hi everybody, so we are going to be looking at Act 2, Scene 1 and Scene 2 in this scene. We're not going to spend a lot of time on Scene 1 because there's a lot of stuff to analyze from Scene 2. So, things we need to know from Act 2, Scene 1. We are outside the Capulet household after the feast, and having left the feast, Romeo feels like he can't go home because he longs to be with Juliet after their time spent together. Alright? He actually leaps over the Capulet orchard wall when he hears Benvolio and Mercutio approaching and making kind of rude remarks about Romeo and his love life. Now, Romeo goes to see, or we know that he wants to go and see Juliet again. So he's not going home, he's going to see Juliet, and he knows that he is in absolute terrible danger if he is found there. But he doesn't care because the only thing on his mind is Juliet up until this point. Themes to note during this scene is just Romeo and his sense of isolation again. So the theme of isolation. Romeo begins a separation from his friends that continues throughout the play. His inability to reveal his love of a Capulet heightens this isolation. Okay, because now he has separated himself from Mercutio and Benvolio in this scene. He even goes to the length to hide from them. And we know that he can't reveal his love of a Capulet because of the feud between Montagues and Capulet as families. Also, by leaping the wall surrounding the Capulet orchard, he actually physically separates himself from Mercutio and Benvolio. So we have the idea that he has a different point of view of Mercutio and Benvolio based on his view of love, but we also see him physically separating himself from his friends, and with the love of Juliet now, perhaps his own family. So this brings us to a very famous scene, Act 2, Scene 2, also known as the balcony scene. So Romeo stands beneath Juliet's bedroom window, and Juliet appears on the balcony thinking that she's alone. And then in a monologue type of speech, she declares her love for Romeo while she can't see anybody listening. So she can't see Romeo, and she gives a monologue about how she loves Romeo, but she also explains how she does not approve of the feud and the problem that it creates. So she opposes, much like Romeo, the feud between the Capulet and Montagues. Romeo listens, and then Juliet kind of hears something in the distance and calls on him to reveal who he is. He reveals himself, and they exchange expressions of their love and devotion toward each other. Now, the nurse, we know that the nurse lives in the Capulet household, calls Juliet away, but she can't help but return to Romeo, who is standing beneath her balcony. Actually, in this conversation, they even agree to marry each other. So just think about that. They just met that night, and they already believe that they love each other so much that they agree to marry. However, with that being said, they don't marry right then and there. Juliet promises to send a messenger the next day so that Romeo can explain the wedding arrangements. The scene eventually concludes as day breaks and Romeo leaves to seek the advice of Friar Lawrence. Now, Friar Lawrence is like a priestly figure and somebody that Romeo turns to when he's having difficulty. And this will be consistent throughout the play moving forward. So he always goes to Friar for advice whenever he is having trouble, and he is kind of like his confidant. Next, we are looking at the light and dark imagery throughout this scene. Now, Shakespeare uses light and dark imagery to describe the blossoming romance between Romeo and Juliet. Juliet is compared to the sun and the stars, and as a bright angel, and as Romeo stands in the shadows, he looks to the balcony and compares Juliet to the sun. Now, Romeo also implies that her very appearance is enough to banish nighttime. And if you want to look at these lines, they go into the actual specific lines are from Act 2, Scene 2, lines 5 to 25, if you want to write those down in your notes. So again, light and dark imagery, Romeo always comparing Juliet to brightness and light is consistent moving forward in this scene. So, themes to identify within this scene. We have identity. So when Juliet says, "What's in a name?" when they're talking about what does it mean to be a Montague or Capulet? Does it matter? So the idea of how a name can shape who you are and how it can limit what you can do. Because think about it, Romeo and Juliet, they want to be together, but what prevents them from being together is their name as a Montague or Capulet. So it begs the question of your identity, your personal identity. Also, we have the idea of pure and innocent love. So Shakespeare describes the pure and innocent quality of their love by juxtaposing the balcony scene, so putting it together, which with Mercutio's lewd sexual jokes in the previous scene. So Mercutio in the previous scene makes very vulgar jokes about love. In scene 1, when they're looking for Romeo and calling out his name, and Romeo jumps over the orchard, and that basically putting those scenes side by side to each other really highlights the innocence of love and youth that is on display between Romeo and Juliet. We also have the idea of fate, meaning that Juliet seeks her own fate rather than the destiny imposed upon her by her parents. And she does this by introducing the idea of marriage to Romeo. Because remember, if we go back a couple scenes, we know that Lady Capulet and the nurse were talking about Juliet considering Paris for marriage. And she is actually taking this into her own hands and mentioning the idea to Romeo, which shows her strength and her power throughout this scene. So she's taking fate into her own hands and making her own decisions, which is very important when we look at her through a feminist lens, meaning that women in that period of time were typically supposed to just kind of be a follower and do what your parents would like. But Juliet is making her own decisions and going against her parents' wishes. So, Romeo, character development. So how has he changed throughout this scene? Well, he's no longer concerned with himself, but thinks of Juliet and kind of her safety. And he is willing to sacrifice his family, society, and basically his life for her. So he's putting everything on the line for Juliet. And so, although Romeo has matured to an extent, he remains somewhat immature compared to Juliet. He would marry Juliet right then and there, while she's a little bit more cautious about it. An example of that is when she needs Romeo to prove that he is devoted to her. Now, when looking at other character traits of Juliet through this scene, it's really important that we get a couple down in our notes. Some that are very important throughout this scene is her sense of realism compared to that of Romeo. Okay, she's very practical and concerned with Romeo's safety and her own. So she's a little bit more cautious, but also we still get the idea that she is confident and she knows how she feels, and she is one that can make decisions. So she increasingly shows confidence by introducing the idea of marriage. However, she wants to be sure that this is the right thing to do. So the example that I put here is she stops Romeo from swearing his love on the moon, as the moon is too inconstant and changing, and she wants him to express it genuinely the way that she would like, so that she knows that this is something that she can really depend on, and this is something worth fighting for. The last thing that I want you to make note of is her maturity in this situation. So she actually realizes that they're moving way too quick, having met that night and agreeing to marry each other. She's a little bit more realistic, that she even says that this is too rash, too unadvised, too sudden. So for her to say that, she is very self-aware of what is going on. Well, compared to Romeo, he is very I would say, very in the moment with how he's feeling and with his emotions. So that does it for Act 2, Scene 2. make sure you start reading the next scenes and filling out your chart. The charts that were handed in so far from Act 1 were done very well with a lot of detail, which is great to see, knowing that you're doing the work and keeping up. I would encourage you to watch the first 24 minutes of the film that I posted, just so you can see Act 1 while you are reading it. It's a good idea just so you can kind of put faces to characters and so on. It's good to see actual character action. So begin reading the rest of Act 2 and I will post a video. Make sure you're checking the Google Classroom for the schedule.